Sorry about that. I appreciate everyone's patience. You can see the announcements. Not much has changed, but we are live on Facebook now. So make sure that you share Hacham's Facebook page and YouTube and all the social media that we just started. So get subscribed to that. And without further ado, please Hacham whenever he is ready.
And mention our sponsor, please.
Oh, sorry. Our sponsor this evening is the Benham family. Thank you very much. Lazaku Baruch to them.
Okay. Even though tonight's shiur has a new title, it still has its roots in the previous two lectures, whereas the emphasis then was on prayer, and particularly prayer versus theurgy. Somehow we got, I won't say derailed, because it was deliberate. We had to go into theurgy and how it ever found a foothold in the synagogue. And we traced it back to Kabbalah. Then we got into the question of what is Kabbalah, where did it come from, and try and contextualize it. Everyone's heard of Kabbalah and has a vague idea what it is, heard of the Zohar and so on. And it's not always easy to pigeonhole it. So we began that process last time a little bit by discussing the age, date, and provenance of the Zohar in particular, because that is the major and most definitive Kabbalistic work. That's about as far as we got. And we looked at the various opinions and how some tried to push it back in time, almost 2,000 years, and others analyzed it very thoroughly over the generations and concluded that they could date it fairly precisely around the year 1290 and attribute it to Moses de Leon. And we said that even Gershon Shalom, who started off in his early days of Kabbalistic research, he actually published an article saying the core of the Zohar is probably very old, but then it was embellished and much of it is medieval. And later he confessed that that's what he thought. But some decades later, he concluded that he was wrong and that it was all by one author, whom he named. So knowing the date of a book tells you nothing about its content. Even less does it tell you what relevance it has for us and what it has to tell us, what's its message. So I thought we need to do that. We need to delve into it. And we're going to have some quotes actually from the Zohar itself. We must always let the witness speak for him or herself. That's the halacha, not talk about people behind their back. So whoever the author is, let him speak to us. So we're going to do that among other things. But again, we always need to contextualize. And tonight we're going to think about compatibility. Where does it fit in to Talmud, Bible, and so on? I have to tell you that Gershon Shalom was probably the greatest researcher of Kabbalistic literature. He really left very few stones unturned, and those he left unturned have, I think, mostly been discovered by his students and successors. Continues today, but the lion's share was taken care of by Gershom Shalom, and his contribution is, of course, vital. However, one caveat, I'm going to say it right out. I discussed it with a friend of mine who's also a great scholar and has written on Kabbalah. And I told him that this was my conclusion and that I'd read it somewhere about Gershom Shalom, but I think it's only fair to share it. Is it negative? Take it as you want. When he spoke as a scholar, he was absolutely impeccable. But he also had his personal opinions. And of course, they were somewhat subjective, I think. So most people's opinions and interpretations somewhat subjective. Well, he was very critical of people like Gretz and the great Enlightenment Jewish historians, because they did not appreciate Kabbalah at all. They wrote about it and they also researched it, but they had extremely negative things to say about it. And Gershom Shalom did not. He had a very positive approach. And it's always puzzled me. And once I read a remark in a book, I think by Tishby, and he said, Gershom Shalom veered away from all his predecessors of the 19th century, who all had an extremely poor opinion of the Zohar, because they were rationalists and historians and scholars. Shalom, in addition to all that, he was a romantic. He belonged to the romantic movement. You see this in all his writings. And romanticism was in a way a reaction to rationalism. There are many books about romanticism and what its essence is. What is its central characteristic? What differentiates it from what came before? And most agree that at heart, it didn't want to follow reason alone. It said emotion has to come into it. Poetry can be appreciated for what it is, but if you want to analyze it too closely and pull it apart, what's left of it? Music, works of art are appreciated holistically. But when you start chopping them up, you have little bits of clay and little bits of painting and a note here and a note there. So it's got to be looked at holistically, and that you can do best, not through analysis, but through appreciation, and that's where subjectivity comes into it. That was the essence of the Romantic movement, which was very powerful in Europe in the later part of the 19th century. And Shalom was part of it. So therefore, for him, this was an ancient book, and he looked at it as a kind of poem. And when you read it that way, maybe it's the only way you can say, okay, it has a place at the table. Because very fanciful, and it has, as you know, all these scenes where things happen, tales of people meeting creatures on the street and wandering around. And some of the stories take place in heaven, some on earth, some on mountains, some on roadsides, some in caves, all over the place. And the dramatis personae are quite interesting too as well. The Ahu Sava, the Ahu Yanuka, and so on. So it's dressed up, you could say, in a very interesting garb and quite fascinating. But what is at the heart of it? What are the ideas that it's trying to convey? And what was its purpose? What was it doing? And how did it come about? And is it compatible? Always the question with Torah, or is it not? Most of the great writers, we'll come to what Shalom said. There's one quote which I have to read from him, so that again he could speak for himself. But those who came before him did not think it was compatible with Torah. Those who really studied it, not those who just venerated it. So now we look at our first source, which comes from the Torah itself. Genesis 1:31. This is the climax of the first creation story, which occupies the first chapter of Genesis. And it says, I'll read it in the English, and God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Evening came and morning came, a sixth day. Pretty straightforward. Everything that he had made was very good. No exceptions. In the time of the prophet, whom we call second or third Isaiah, probably the second Isaiah, monotheism was under siege. Let me explain the background. I'm not going to quote Saadia Gaon, but he was probably one of the first to say it. And he commented on this verse from Isaiah, which we're going to read in a moment. And he said, this is a very polemical verse, and it's against the dualists. But besides Saadia Gaon, historians wrote the same thing. They said it was addressed to Cyrus. It says so in the chapter. If you look at chapter 45, it says this is a message for Cyrus, the Persian emperor. And to him, it was very important to say there is only one God. Let's read it, and then I'll try and explain why this message was so urgent. This is the second source. So he says, okay, I'll say it in English, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none but I, God is saying through his prophet. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness, make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now you see, when the Jews were living in Mesopotamia, their neighbors were Zoroastrians by this time. And of course, I think it's well known that Zoroastrianism had a huge impact on the Jews living in exile, and somehow it filtered to Christianity and Islam. Now, there's huge literature on this. The late Professor Jacob Neusner is perhaps one, I don't think he was a pioneer, but he wrote a whole book on it and dwelt on it extensively. Specific connections we can see. And it's almost certain that these things that are so recognizably Zoroastrian came from Zoroastrianism. They were unknown in Israel previously. No trace of them in the early books of the Bible. All of a sudden, we hear about them. Now, when did Zoroaster live? So, according to traditional Parsis and Zoroastrians, he lived around the year 350 before the Common Era. Some scholars say that's wrong, he lived earlier. So this is a debate between the traditionalists, which is interesting, who date him much later than some scholars. And why do some scholars push him earlier back in time? Because there's very little literature which goes back to Zoroaster himself. And what is the exception is the book called the Avesta. And these are poems written in a very archaic language, certainly not even Middle Persian, let alone later Persian. It's a language which is kindred with Sanskrit. So, and it's very hard to figure out what is being said in those poems. First of all, because poetry is difficult, always full of symbolism. And secondly, because of the archaic nature of this language in which very few books are written. That's why they call it Avestan, the language. And here again is a debate among scholars. I think today most scholars agree that probably the original message of Zoroaster was monotheistic. And many phrases in there which point in that direction. But perhaps he was not emphatic enough. And those who came after him read his words as positing a kind of dualism. And eventually Zoroastrianism became dualistic. The power of good and the power of evil. And the whole religion, as time went on, was about this struggle in the world. And to this very day, they tell you that their purpose in life is to observe all the rituals of their faith in order to give strength to the good force and to be able to conquer the evil force. So it was against this background, according to Saadia Gaon and many others, that Isaiah was speaking. No, there's one God who created everything, things that we call evil. What does evil mean? Things that are uncomfortable, things that we don't like viruses. In their day, it was also, they had plagues and wild animals attacking their livestock, all kinds of things. From the human point of view, they called them evil. In God's plan, they had a place, but they were inconvenient, uncomfortable, sometimes painful to people. And so it was much easier to account for these troublesome phenomena by saying they come from another source. It's the easy way out. And the Torah's way is more difficult. God created everything and said it's all very good, seen from the divine point of view, from the bigger plan. And then Isaiah is saying specifically, even things that we call bad also are made by the one God. There is no other. Kabbalah was perhaps the first to break with that tradition. Not the first in Israel, of course not, because the prophets all the time are criticizing the idolaters. So there's always that temptation. Remember the arguments they had with Jeremiah when they said to him, we worship the Queen of Heaven. So they believed in a king and queen of heaven, and they had to bake these special cakes for the Queen of Heaven. In short, the dualistic outlook is easy, and it's a very slippery slope. And how did these people who invented the Kabbalah or who introduced it into a Jewish guise, why did they go down that path? So I picked out a section from the Zohar, which I think is very telling, because it gives away something of the thinking behind this dualistic aspect of the Kabbalah. Before we do it, since it relates to the scapegoat, we're first going to read the verse in the Torah where the scapegoat is introduced, because that's what the Zohar is commenting on. So the verse in Leviticus says, Aaron shall place lots on the two goats, one lot for the Lord and one lot for Azazel. Whoever reads this verse immediately thinks, okay, that's dualism for you. One lot for Hashem, one lot for another. And they're on a par, they're equal. Each one is getting something. Now, of course, some modern scholars believe that indeed this is dualistic, and that we see here the beginnings of Zoroastrian influence. I'm not saying if it's correct or not. This is a huge debate, and there are many ways to approach it. We leave that aside. But it certainly opens the door to something which is very far removed from true monotheism. Whether it intended it that way or not, the impressions are sometimes what counts. Now we should look at the Zohar's comments on the scapegoat. Okay, it's a longish piece, but we'll try and wade through it. Observe this, says the Zohar. The goat which the Israelites sent down to Azazel into the desert with the intention of giving to the other side a portion, so pacifying and keeping it occupied that it might not do harm to the sons of the kingdom. So this a force called the other side. The Zohar is full of it. It's called Sitra Achra. Never hear of it anywhere in the Bible, such a thing. There is a mention of Satan in a few places, and some think that this was an angel. Others thought it was a person, believe it or not. Commentators on the Talmud say quite explicitly the Satan of Job was human. This was a human being who was complaining about Job and saying about him the nasty things that we read in the first chapters of the book of Job. not an angel. But others said, no, he was an angel. But everyone agreed that angels, when they did appear in the Bible, were messengers of the deity and had no standing of their own. They were very low grade servants, if you like, who were sent here and there, and certainly didn't have names and didn't have any independent powers. In that very story you see it. He has to ask God, may I go and hit Eeyov? And he says, yes, you can, but you may not take his life. He's completely subservient to the one above him. But this Sitra Achra is far more potent, as we'll see as we go on. So pacifying and keeping it occupied. But it may be objected, why then was it necessary to have two goats, one to the Lord and one to the other side? The answer to this question can be gathered from the following parable. Okay, now, watch very carefully this parable and remember, we haven't seen it yet, sorry, but be prepared for the king in the parable to be Kivyachol, standing for God. And then you will see the other characters fall into place more or less. A king once became angered with his son, and he called to that minister whose office it was to punish offenders, that he might be at hand to chastise his son on the morrow. So he sent for this minister who was in charge of clobbering people, whom the king didn't like, obviously. Nothing about a trial or any rule of law. The king was the law in that society, I guess, and he sent for this minister. The minister in high spirits was overjoyed and entered the palace to partake of food there. He's moving into the palace now in preparation for tomorrow. The prince, on seeing him, thought to himself, surely that man comes here to no good, and doubtless because my father is angry with me. So what did the son do? He straightway went in to his father and persuaded him to forgive him. So he patched things up with his father. Then the king commanded that a banquet should be prepared for him and his son, but that the minister should not be told about it. For the king thought to himself, should he, the minister, get wind of the repast which he had ordered for himself and his son, he will disturb our meal. What then did the king do? He called to his chamberlain and said to him, prepare first a meal for this minister, in order that he may imagine that I am showing him a mark of special favor by giving a banquet in his honor, and so be satisfied and depart without knowing anything of the previous meal which I ordered, and which we will consume, just me and my son, after the minister has gone. Therefore, let him, as I have said, take his part and then go, that our joy may be complete and undisturbed. And so it was done. Now, if the king had not dealt thus with his minister and his son, the former, the minister, would not have left the palace, and the feast of forgiveness would have been marred. Now, what do we take away from this? The minister was a man, the king was a man. They were both human, and both had some standing, and they pitted each other's sort of psychological warfare between them, and they're outwitting each other. It is totally incredible for anyone who's used to reading the Bible when he or she stumbles on this story, in which God, Kivyachol, is not omnipotent, but just the opposite. He has to find ploys and stratagems to outwit the minister. It tells you everything. The Sitra Achara is a force that the God of the Zohar has to reckon with. This story is impossible in the Bible. God neither needs a minister to come in and intervene between him and his son. The whole story, in fact, is ridiculous. And the son just goes in and the father makes peace with him. Why didn't he go in earlier? Why did he wait only when he sees the minister? But all that, the incongruence of the story itself, we can leave for literary critics to level against it. It's an absurd story in itself, but that's not why we're interested in it. We have to evaluate it from the Torah point of view. Is it or is it not compatible? If the Sitra Achra is like the Satan of the Bible, the late books of the Bible perhaps, then God doesn't have to wiggle and wriggle to get round him. There's no need for that. In fact, the biblical writers could never think of such an idea. It was exactly what they were fighting against. So I told you that I had noticed things in the Zohar that were also, or had their parallels in the commentaries of Nachmanides, of Ramban, on the Torah. And I remember saying to people, I think I quoted this last time, Ramban is very careful to give his sources. Many books that are lost, and he tells us, Sefer Chanoch and all kinds of books, he always quotes. He doesn't take credit for things that are not his own original ideas. Isn't it strange that these ideas that we find in the Zohar, Nachmanides never attributes them? And the person I said this to, I remember, he said, you must understand, the Zohar was not allowed to be revealed to the world until its appointed hour. Therefore, he could not let on. And I said to this person, sorry, that doesn't work. The Ramban was a very honest man. If his hands were tied, inasmuch as he could not mention the Zohar, then he would have said, I read this book somewhere, I read this idea in a certain book, something like that. Or made it clear that it was not his original idea. He didn't need to quote the book by name. He could just have said, some have said, or someone has said. There's so many different ways of getting around it without giving anything away. And the person had no answer whatsoever. And I said, well, my answer is that I think the Zohar took it from Nachmanides. That is possible. Nachmanides was too honorable a man to say things in his own name, which he had borrowed from somewhere else. Of course, this argument was very minor. Later, when I read books by scholars, I saw that this played only a very small role, but still, to me, it was very significant. Now you decide for yourselves whether there's any resemblance between what we just saw in the Zohar and what Nachmanides wrote about the scapegoats. I'll read it in the English. You have to contemplate the scriptural text as it is written and also as it is read according to the Masoretic tradition. Now, the Torah has absolutely forbidden to accept them as deities. Them, he was talking before about the idols and the gods of the idolaters, or to worship them in any manner. However, the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded us that on the Day of Atonement we should let loose a goat in the wilderness to that prince which rules over wastelands, and this goat is fitting for that prince, because he is its master, and destruction and waste emanate from that power, which in turn is the cause of the stars of the sword, wars, quarrels, wounds, plagues, division and destruction. In short, it is, he translates it, the spirit, but I think Galgal is the planet. If they knew the word planet, Mars. So they believed that Mars was associated with blood, the red planet. This is a very old idea, and you'll find it in ancient books all over the world. So Ramban accepts that unquestioningly, and therefore, since this power which dwells in the desert is associated with Mars and has great power, it is also in charge of all these destructive forces in the world. And its portion among the nations is Esau, the people that inherited the sword and the wars. And among animals, its portion consists of the Seirim, the demons, and the goats. Also in its portion are the devils, called destroyers in the language of the rabbis, and in the language of scripture, Seirim, satires or demons. For thus he and his nation were called Sa'ir. Now, the intention in our sending away the goat to the desert was not that it should be an offering from us to it, heaven forbid. He adds heaven forbid because he realizes, yes, he's on very, very hazardous ground. Rather, our intention should be to fulfill the wish of our Creator, who commanded us to do so. This may be compared to the case of someone who makes a feast for his master. And the master commands the person making the feast, give one portion to that particular servant of mine. In that case, the host gives nothing of his own to that servant, and it is not to show him honor that he acts in that way, but everything is given to the master, and it is the master that gives the gift to his servant. The host only observes his command and does in honor of the master whatever he commanded him to do. The master, however, out of his own compassion for the host, wanted all his servants to derive some enjoyment from it, from the feast, in order that they may all speak of the host with praise and shortcoming. This then is the reason for casting lots on the goats. Now, I think the similarities are too obvious. The feast, the three characters, the master, the other one was a king, it's the same thing, and ordering a feast and giving something to a particular servant. Why? To keep him happy. He says so that he will praise the host. If the master, again, if the master represents God, what is this? He has to bribe servants in order to get them to say words of praise. It's nowhere near the Zohar, but it's on that path. It's on that path. Because Ramban didn't have the Zohar, but he was a proto-Kabbalist. And these ideas had crept in, unfortunately, here and there in his commentary. We see it very clearly. So we all revolt against this parable and say, sorry, it's totally inapplicable and inappropriate. Unless you really believe that that was what Scripture was saying. And then those modern scholars who read dualism into that verse, you're saying they're right. That's what we have here. God is saying, I have to bribe some power who lives out in the desert and who is under the influence of Mars, needs to be assuaged. Not because the dangerous power, as in the other one, that the minister hanging around could upset things, because he's always a menace. The minister who wants to have a job and wants to be able to punish the son. So he's a real imminent threat. Therefore, he has to be kept away. And that's why the gifts have to be given. That is not in Ramban. Ramban is not saying it's a danger, but he is saying, in a more positive way, if we want him to praise and to be on board, then we need to give him a gift. I told you that I would read something out of Shalom, to let him speak for himself. He realized the incompatibility of some of the Zoharic ideas with the monotheism of Bible and Talmud, Maimonides, of all that came before. What did he do? This is what he writes in his book called Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. I've always thought he was wrong to call it mysticism, because it isn't. Kabbalah is not mysticism, it's mythology. Or in many words you could give it to name it accurately, but not mysticism. The peculiar affinity of Kabbalist thought to the world of myth cannot well be doubted, and should certainly not be obscured or lightly passed over by those of us to whom the notion of a mythical domain within Judaism seems strange and paradoxical, and who are accustomed to think of Jewish monotheism as the classical example of the religion which has severed all links with the mythical. It is indeed surprising that in the very heart of Judaism, ideas and notions sprang up which purported to interpret its meaning better than any others, and which yet represent a relapse into, or if you like, a revival of, the mythical consciousness. This is particularly true of the Zohar and the Lurianic Kabbalah, that is to say, of those forms of Jewish mysticism which have exerted by far the greatest influence, and which for centuries stood out in the popular mind. It is no use getting indignant over these facts, as the great historian Gretz did. They should rather set us thinking. The importance of the history of the Jewish people, particularly during the past 4 centuries, has been far too great to permit them to be ridiculed and treated as mere deviations. Now comes the punchline. Perhaps, after all, there is something wrong with the popular conception of monotheism as being opposed to the mythical. Perhaps monotheism contains room after all on the deeper plane for the development of mythical law. So he's saying, he's playing with words here. I remember once reading an article in a sort of anthology many years ago. It was a very strange one. And it was the first time I'd ever come across an idea which now I see is more or less echoed by Shalom, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe Shalom's book appeared before that article that I read. Anyway, the man wrote as follows. He said, I think it's a mistake to define Judaism as monotheistic, because if it were, there couldn't possibly be any room for a system such as the Kabbalah, which talks of a king and queen of heaven, of 10 Sephirot, which are all divine, and he goes on and on and on. That could never have happened. Therefore, the only conclusion is to say that is not what defines Judaism. So what does? He doesn't say. But on finishing the article, I realized that what he thought Judaism was could not be defined as any kind of belief system, but it was simply whatever Jews did. The majority of Jews worshipped Baal. That was Judaism in its day. And I remember writing that in the margin of that article. I said, well, in the days of Elijah, when the Bible tells us there were only 7,000 left in Israel who did not kneel down to Baal, right? So I said, quite right. Now you will tell us that is true Judaism, because you say whatever a great number or a majority, I've forgotten which way you put it, of Jews decide upon, that becomes Judaism. Jews are a people, that's all, a nation, a group, an ethnicity. And whatever they believe is Judaism, because that's what a lot of Jews believe. And if they don't believe anything, then that's Judaism. This is called semantic games. Torah doesn't use the word Judaism. Forget about that word. It's completely alien to Torah. Torah speaks about Torah and Revelation, never about Judaism. This is a word that was imposed on them from outside. And now he's taking that word and making it determinant of what we all have to accept. And unfortunately, Shalom went in the same direction. I can't judge if he was religious or not. Many people say he was not religious. He was just a Zionist, and therefore to him, again, everything in Jewish history was of interest and value. And he did not think Torah was at the center or anything like that. Again, I never met him. I never spoke to him. I never asked him these questions. And he's no more alive, so we can't ask him. But he did, again, to give credit to Shalom, he did recognize two very important and salient facts. A, that the Zohar was deeply, deeply influenced by Plotinus and Neoplatonism, and he even showed how it spread into Provence at the time and how easy it was to pick it up in the very air you breathe. And he also recognized Gnosticism and also showed the route that Gnosticism took and how it came into contact with the Jews of that period. And Gnosticism, of course, is dualistic. Entirely so. That's what it's all about, Gnosticism. I'm not going to quote now because why do we need to hear it? It's what the Talmud called Shtei Rashiyot. These were the minim that they were always debating. It's very clear from many, many sources. It's not always, minim could be sectarians, could be all kinds of sectarians that they were arguing with. But when it's about the Shtei Rashiyot, it's almost certainly Gnostics, because some of the arguments are preserved. We shall end where we began, with verses from Scripture, which have the most direct bearing. I said that Neoplatonism contributed greatly to Zoharic ideas. In particular, and this I think we discussed briefly last time, Neoplatonism was monotheistic because its author, because its inventor, you could say, Plotinus himself was fighting the Gnostics of his day. He died in the year 270, so I could say 3rd century. That was the heyday of the Gnostics, and he was fighting them and was saying, no, there is only one God. However, what is your problem? The problem is, you say, how could this great and mighty God have any contact with our lowly and humble and corrupt earth and earthlings? And he himself believed that. He also thought that such a great and mighty and ineffable being somehow cannot be associated with such lowly creatures. I think I said last week that they lived in a very hierarchical society where the emperor spoke to his courtiers and the courtiers passed on messages to those below them. Very strict pecking order existed. And so that's what he thought. So they had to be intermediaries between the highest and the lowest. And he provided them, did Plotinus. And obviously, that's where the Kabbalists got it from. So they also, although it was not exactly the same, the Sephirot did not quite coincide with those intermediaries of Plotinus, not exactly, but the idea is obviously the same. Again, the Torah expresses its own view, which is diametrically opposite. Who is like the Lord our God, throned in exaltation? The one who looks down to both the heavens and the earth. Everything is his creation. Makes no difference if they're higher. In what sense are they higher? They're all the works of Hashem's hands, if you like, to put it anthropomorphically. So his contact with those spheres should be just as great a problem as his association with us mortals, and vice versa. He will talk to whomever he wants. And that's the whole principle of revelation. If he wishes, he can speak directly to all of us and doesn't need intermediaries. And we don't need intermediaries when we pray. No, more than that. We cannot have intermediaries. As soon as we acknowledge intermediaries, we have already broken loose from Torah. I put it very starkly now because I think we have to. because the dear, sweet romanticists still are out there telling us, oh, it's such a beautiful image. Yes, I won't deny it. We read a piece of the Zohar, and everyone can decide for themselves if they think it's beautiful, if they think it's poetic, if they think it has great inspirational value. That's fine. I will not, under any circumstances, impose this or that opinion, nor even share what I think of it, beyond what I said already, as a way to convey the idea of the divine. It certainly is not compatible with Torah. That's all we can say. Thank you. Any comments or criticisms, questions?
So, hello to everyone on Facebook. Mitch on Facebook has a comment. He says, there's an interesting smichut haparshiot where we start with the avodat Yom Kippur, then transition to the prohibition of korbanot outside the Mishkan, machlochet, whether the section is centered exclusively on kodeshim brought outside the Mishkan or possibly dealing with chulin. In that flow, we moved from goral achat lashem, goral achat la'azazel, to forbidding zevachim, to silirim, satyrs. This satyr in Greek mythology was a god of the forest who resembled a goat. From the biblical text, historians, silirim referred to a god that governed the arid, the desert, that would make the great sense of shepherds leading their flock through the long stretches of desert would be susceptible to attack by nomads, pillagers, etc. And then he asked, how should we then relate to malachim in Mikra, especially in where it appears they are not necessarily mortal, e.g. Lot, Sodom?
Well, the question of the connection between chapter 16, chapter 17 of Leviticus, this goes back to Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra said, if you want to know the significance of the two goats in that verse that we read with the two gorals, you have to move ahead 33 verses. And when you go ahead 33 verses, you come to the verse, let them not offer up their sacrifices to the demons or the satyrs. All right, so that connection is well known, but we can't go into it now in any great depth. That would take us into, whole Bible exegesis, which is not what we're doing now, but it's very interesting, thank you. And the other question, that people believed in satyrs, that's what we saw in the Zohar. Yes, that they had power in the desert, for sure. It's a very, very old and ancient mythology, which somehow recrudesced. And we can't explain it now. It's a long story, but thank you, Joe, for bringing it up. Okay.
Well, and if there are no other questions, again, Chazaku Baruch, and thank you to the Benham family. If you wish to sponsor a shiur yourself, please email me. My email is there in the chat. If you would like to donate to Destination Torah, the link is there as well. As of right now, all the previous shiurim that I had are now available on YouTube. So if you wish to view them again or share them with your study buddies, you can now do that via YouTube. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow Destination Torah on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, anywhere where you do social media. And Sidor Alatz Libi is available. That's Hakham Sidor. And email contributing editor Rabbi Steve Golden, and his email is also there in the chat. And with that, I hope everyone has an excellent evening.